Okay, this is part two of the slavery presentation screencast. Looking at this timeline here, I'm not sure why the uh, text here is on some sort of weird angle, but we have slavery, segregation, and we have entrenched indirect racism. So all I did here is take some of the terms like the slave codes, the Civil War, and I put them in this timeline just to give you an idea of some of the long-term causes for institutionalized racism, some of the history that is definitely going to impact more of the present day events that these topics seem to address. So for the most part, you want to keep in mind the feeling possibly that the government is not looking out for the best interests of the people impacted by legislation, the Civil War, and how there always seems to be some sort of half-assed solution to dealing with the issue of slavery, dealing with the issue of freedom, as well as segregation. So by the time we get to the early 1900s, we see the lynching of African Americans starting to really heat up in this country, where it's documented, advertised, and so on. One of the women fighting to deal with lynching, suggesting an anti-lynching bill, was Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells had worked and tried to lobby to get what becomes known as the Dyer Bill. I believe I have some text of the Dyer Bill here, where the federal government is trying to enact punishment for lynching, especially if it takes place in the state, as you can see right here from this section here, that is going to hold the state accountable, as it tells you here. If they neglect or refuse to provide and maintain protection for the life of any person, which a lynching would occur. So for the most part, for the early 1900s, African Americans are definitely going to be lynched. This is an image of the lynching museum prior to this place opening up. This was when it was in the development phases. And you might even want to listen to the song Strange Fruit. Keep in mind what that may or may not be about as you listen to that particular piece. So for the most part, lynchings definitely taking place in the United States history. More black lynched than white, and anybody can be lynched. When you look up the definition, it's going to talk about trial without a jury, but seems to be in this country that African Americans definitely seem to be the target of lynching violence in comparison to other groups. Fast forward to Brown 2. If you looked up this, I included this one because we are probably familiar with Brown versus Board of Ed. You probably are not familiar with Brown 2. So we know that the federal government in Brown is trying to force the states to comply with integration of the schools. So this is the federal legislation saying integrate, and now they have to do that because of the federal government mandating. So what could possibly be a loophole, a way around this legislation by the states, is to just say, well, we're going to do this eventually. We're working on it. So while the federal government is trying to mandate, the states have pretty much found a way around the federal legislation to maintain the status quo and allow segregation in schools to continue. In other words, they're saying we're working on it. It's going to take time, which is why Brown 2 has to be pass, which mentions you have to do it with deliberate speed. That's the difference. Deliberate speed, time constraint versus no time constraint. Greensboro sit-in. Here we have yet a challenge to a different kind of segregation law, which is about the lunch counters. And we see the Greensboro sit-ins. And keep in mind, as the demonstrators are going to be targeted, for the most part, these would be the individuals arrested. They're the ones starting the disturbance, not the individuals that are showing up to protest against their protest. Police brutality and the Black Panther Party. So the Black Panther Party emerges as a group trying to challenge police brutality. Why? Because there are numerous riots that take place in the 60s, and the one thing they have in common is the police. And so the Black Panther Party emerges as a group trying to advocate for the protection of blacks within their neighborhood. Here I just have an image of the council of the Black Panther Party, which would be targeted by the Council Pro, which was a CIA organization designed to crack down on leftist groups and radical groups like the Klan, like the Gay Liberation Front. And in this case, we're looking at the Black Panther Party, which I guess is debatable whether or not this is a radical group or a political group or a terrorist group. But looking at their 10-point program, they're talking about wanting freedom, wanting full employment for our people. They want to end to the robbery by the capitalists of their black communities and so on. So the Black Panther Party definitely gets the label of a militant group. However, it's debatable about whether or not they actually count as that label being accurate. Another topic given is the busing boycott. So we in the 50s are familiar with Brown versus Board of Ed. We know that in the 60s we have the civil rights legislation. And by the time you get to the 70s, I always look at the 70s as a turning point. You know, we're about to adjust to something new. And in this case, we're looking at Boston and the busing debate that emerges. And not just in Boston, but Boston is definitely the place where this heats up. So you have a town, and let's just say you have a segregated, de facto segregated area. For some reason, the black population lives here. Let's say the white population lives here. And I don't know, this is a mixed area. So what busing is going to do is take students and move them by bus into these areas, as well as possibly vice versa. But for the most part, this is something that is going to put black students in a position where they're going to be bused into white areas. This is definitely going to be protested. As you could see here, the school buses en route to education, they definitely are going to be targeted by moms trying to prevent the students from getting into the all-white school, which is segregated not because of any law, but it's segregated because of de facto segregation. So you might want to look up that term, de facto segregation. I asked you to look up Ted Landsmark. Landsmark is protesting. There's a lot of debate about this photograph. It looks like the individual is about to stab him with the flag. I believe the name of this photograph is The Soiling of Old Glory. They would also argue that this individual was helping him up as he had fallen down. Either way, the image doesn't do anything to help ease racial tensions between blacks and whites. Another group, the Weathered Underground. So the SDS, this was an organization protesting the Vietnam War. Its hardcore members had split, creating an organization called the Weathered Underground. They protested the Vietnam War as well as race in America. This was an all-white terrorist organization advocating on behalf of African Americans in the United States, and they were known to bomb police departments that were accused of targeting and abusing African Americans. Another item, benign neglect. So this is another issue of benign neglect. If you click this link, it'll probably take you to the full document. But for the most part, we know that in the 60s, that's the fight for civil rights. And now we're moving into the 70s, and the Nixon administration is going to try to figure out a way to solve the race problem. And it just says that, let this stuff kind of figure it out on its own. Here they talk about the efforts have been made by the administration to develop programs. So what they're saying here is, we've been trying to develop programs. Those programs have failed. So we pretty much just need to let things kind of work itself out. And that's benign neglect. And the end result is it's going to lead to poverty. Let the race problem resolve itself on its own. Through time, it'll kind of just work itself out. That's benign neglect. Bernie Goetz, in 1984, Bernie Goetz is on a subway. He is approached by a couple of youths, and he pulls out a gun and shoots these individuals. And the end result for Bernie Goetz, as you can see in the slide here, he was acquitted of attempted murder, argued for self-defense. Keep in mind, he has no permit to carry the weapon, and that doesn't seem to be the issue. The issue here seems to be about the shooting of these robbers when he was trying to argue that this was about self-defense. So it's just one of those trials in the 80s of New York City where there seemed to be a couple of them that kind of end in the same fashion. Let's talk about the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia. So MOVE is a organization of black nationalists similar to some of the ideas of the Black Panther Party. And apparently the Philly Police Department, in an effort with a standoff with the MOVE organization, which led to one police officer dead and 16 firefighters injured, you see a situation where the police department of Philly simply drops a bomb from a helicopter, and it set all of these buildings on fire. And the song, The Roof is on Fire, is actually a reference to that particular event in history taking place in 1985. The OJ trial, and the OJ trial is significant because here you seem to see an individual with a lot of evidence against him, and he was able to beat the court system. So In the United States, African Americans seem to be celebrating, and white Americans seem to be upset. And the celebration was due to the fact that this belief that finally somebody with a lot of evidence was able to find not guilty, and the legal system working in their favor. Keep in mind, if you took the OJ trial, all of the same evidence, and put it in 1954 with Emmett Till, this outcome of the case probably would have ended differently. Let's see, what other topics do we have? And that's it.